Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in again. And today we're going to take on another much used word. Again, just briefly, last time we took on the word understanding, and the position that was offered at that time is a very simple definition. It means to stand under. But more importantly, as you visualize what it means to stand under something, it is a position of humility and a position of submission. It's not a position where somebody is standing over somebody or talking down to somebody. And oftentimes an accumulation of knowledge can cause that. There's a big difference between knowledge and understanding, or difference between knowledge and wisdom. So when we have that experience of true understanding, we'll also have an experience of humility and being submissive, being open, being vulnerable, being sensitive. So that's how we'll know when that one is showing up. Today is going to be maybe a little bit more challenging and a little bit more what I want to call trauma informed. I'll get into that a little bit later in some of my presentations. When we start talking about the indulgence triangle and the growing up triangle, trauma vows, things like that, it'll be very challenging and very interesting. But let's take this one on, forgiveness. Again, let's keep it simple, right? Paradox is the name of the game for the mature mind. Less is more. Simplicity is our goal. So keeping it simple. How could we keep this one simple? I'll tell you how. Forgiveness. It means to give forth, to give forward. Pretty simple. Simple to say, huh? But in my practice, what I often see are two things. One, people who feel hurt, who realize that they need to forgive in order to move on with their lives. And oftentimes when that's done, then they wrestle with trying to forgive themselves, which is even the harder task. So it may be easy to throw the word out there, but it gets a little tricky when we start to try to apply it. And I think that's because we don't have the proper position on it. Again, we might be operating out of conditioning or definitions and perspectives and distortions that have been passed on to us through our time here on the planet. Family, community, culture, what have you. So oftentimes, like I said, people at some point, either hear somewhere out there about the importance of forgiveness, or they realize that it's important for them to forgive, to move on. But let me ask you this though. Well, what will happen if the person approaches somebody and they ask them for forgiveness and the person throws it back in their face? Or what would happen if the person that they want to forgive is no longer alive, has passed on? Is it possible to forgive? Some people would say no. Some people don't, it's hard to know. I'm going to say yes, because I want to keep it simple. So what do we really mean when we talk about wanting to forgive or to be forgiven? Let's first talk about the first piece that I talked about. When we want to forgive somebody, we usually want to forgive somebody because that person has hurt us in some way. So what are we really talking about? This is the trauma-informed piece, right? So this is a little bit about the nature of trauma. So when we're hurt, let's call that trauma. It's traumatic. And to give you a little definition of trauma, try this one on. Try this position. An abrupt separation from our expectations. So when we expect to be treated with kindness and we're hurt, the expectation that we had is violated, if you will, or is not met. And the more abrupt that is, and the more sudden, the more intense, the more trauma that there is to it. So we'll call that trauma. So when we feel hurt from somebody, what's the natural reaction? Well, we want to contract. In other words, we want to protect ourselves. It's kind of like circling the wagons. We want to set up some fences and some barriers. Set up fences and barriers around what? And what has been hurt? Well, most people say, my feelings have been hurt. And some people would associate that with their heart and say they've been heartbroken, or that's where they feel the hurt, is in the heart area. So we can set up some barriers and fences around our own heart, like putting on a suit of armor. Seems to make some sense, right? When we do that, though, as right as it might feel to encase our hearts in a protective armor, to surround it with some fences and some barriers, while it keeps us safe, it also keeps contained what I want to call our giftedness, our talents and abilities, our very being, who we are authentically. We become a shell of a person. Not all. It's like if the sun were shining and all of a sudden, it gets foggy out. I mean, you can see some of the sun, but not all of it. You can feel some of the warmth, but not all of it. When we have become contracted like that, we start to feel the effects of it. We start to feel anxiety and depression and irritation and anger. Those are the signs and symptoms. So yes, a need for us to forgive. Remember the definition we're using, though: to give forth. So prior to being hurt, so the story goes, our heart was a little more open, or we were a little more open, and the warmth inside, the love, the joy, the compassion, the empathy, these kinds of things were flowing more freely. So in that moment that I was hurt, I contracted and I began to shut that down, which is really, I guess you could say, hard on myself. So when I start to feel all these symptoms that are going on, the anxiety and depression and despair and sadness and anger, and what is really causing that? Is it the hurt that caused it? Is it what the person did, or is it the contraction that I chose to do? Now, some people will say, well, you don't really choose to do that. And I'm going to say, well, let's slow this down frame by frame. Actually, we did. It's subconscious, but there were some decisions that we made around that. Decisions that at the time seemed like a good idea. Maybe they were temporarily, but now the door to the heart, the armor is still on. Hence the need for forgiveness, to give forth. Now, again, it's kind of what's going to happen if I give forth to somebody who's going to use it against me, who doesn't even want to hear it? Or what if there's nobody to give forth to? Do I just sit here disappointed? Well, from that definition of forgiveness, yes, you would. Your fate has been sealed. This is where, it gets a little more challenging than some of the other words that we have discussed. For whose sake is the question? For whose sake do I give forth? See, when we talk about integrity, integrity is about being one with, whole, undivided, and complete. That's what integrity means. To be fully integrated. To be one with something. Integrity is actually a relationship word. To be one with, to be whole with, to be undivided, to be bonded, fused with. So for whose sake do I give forth? Is the question. Integrity means to be true to myself. So me giving forth, me opening my heart again, is a gift that I give to myself. It's a gift that I give to my most honorable, my most precious self. when I say that, you have to kind of visualize that there's two selves. And sometimes people refer to it as the ego self, and sometimes people refer to it as the authentic self or the noble self or the higher self, whatever you want to call it. But that doesn't take much personal reflection to kind of look inside and go, okay, yeah, there is a part of me that kind of does what it wants to do out in the world, and then there's kind of a part of me that sits back and watches. It's called that conscience. Sometimes that would be one way to refer to it, that we can refer to it to give it some meaning. You know, it's that part of us that sits and watches our behavior. So being true to ourselves, when we're true to ourselves, being true to our authentic self, that part of ourselves that is always there for us, always loving us, always forgiving us. We do it because we have a promise to ourselves. This is where it kind of begins to take on a mythological, archetypal, transpersonal feeling to it. And this is a wonderful place to hang out, but we're not going to hang out here too much today. But just to begin to maybe shift a position here, forgiveness is to give forth of myself for the sake of my true self. See, I don't need somebody to be present. I don't need the person who hurt me to be present in order to forgive. I give forth not for their sake, but for my sake. My being forgiving is in my best interest, period. Why? Because it puts me back into integrity. It restores my integrity. I often say to people, mind your own business. Well, what is your business? Your business is your own integrity. You forgive people not because they need it, they deserve it. We forgive people because it's in our best interest, because it's a reflection of the truth of who I really am, because it's a move towards reintegration. It's a movement towards integrity, to being true to myself, to keeping my promise, or what I would ultimately call our sacred vow. I mean, again, when is integrity tested? It's tested when it hits the fan. It's tested when we are hurt by other people. It's tested when we are disrespected. It's tested when we're misunderstood. It's tested when we're persecuted by our own family members. And it's real natural. Like I said, it's real natural. I mean, that's the kind of the very core of our being is narcissistic and egocentric. And it's very natural, a very natural human reaction that when we're hurt, we want to withdraw. Or we can attack, but even attacking is really a form of withdrawal. It's just inverted. Both are out of integrity for us. To use somebody else's dishonor as a way to justify our own makes us out of integrity. Well, you might say, well, how am I out of integrity? I got hurt. Yeah, but yes, I'm hanging on to the hurt, right? And I'm using their dishonor in order to justify my hanging on. When I have a promise to keep to myself, see, I need to be true to myself. I need to be true to myself above and beyond what they did. So yeah, we can have a lot of fun in this definition and look at it and really begin to see things way more clearly and more powerfully here. So I hope you've enjoyed this bit of a reflection. Give it some thought. If you have any questions, email me and I'll get back to you. And if you'd like to be added to the mailing list, let me know, and I will make sure you get the newest reflections and notice of any presentations and things like that. So thank you for tuning in. Take care.